Progress.
Thank you. Let's pray. Gracious God, thank you for our gathering here today. Teach us, give us your wisdom through our guest speaker. Enlighten us through the words of Torrance, and through that, from the thoughts of Karl Barth. We thank you for your love for us and for your revelation of that to us in Jesus Christ. In his name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Brad. So again, today we are continuing our journey through Karl Barth, Biblical and Evangelical Theologian. Today looking at chapter 5, Natural Theology and the Thought of Karl Barth. Just to throw out some other things, Edward Irving has written Thomas Torrance's Reconstruction of Natural Theology, which, Travis, you can make comments on that if you'd like. There's a response to that that's in participatio by our dear friend who was with us last week, Paul Molnar, and he mentions an article in there that I don't have, Natural Theology Revisited in Zeitschrift für Dialektionstheologie. Do you have that article, Travis?
I don't know.
So anyway, we might get that. That would be interesting. And then
But that's
other...
what when I found out that Paul Molnar spoke last week, I was like, why am I the one doing natural theology? He spent so much more time in it than I have.
And the answer to that is because you are Travis Stevick.
Yeah, well,
and
okay.
Travis Stevick on this topic is what we want. So,
well, and he has made his views known in this group on natural theology.
But he was perfect for last week, and you're great for this week. So, Theology Beyond Christendom. This is an 1886 essays on the centenary of Karl Barth's birth. And so there is an essay in here called Barth and a New Direction for Natural Theology by Ray Anderson, which I think is another important piece of this conversation. So I just wanted to throw this out to say people are talking about this. They're important conversations. To say that people have figured this all out is probably not the case. So to say Molnar, Anderson, and Irving, and Travis Stevick, who did his book on Encountering Reality, and that it deals with the sciences. And so the question of natural science is an important question within that, is to say that in the basics of theological inquiry, natural theology for Barth is certainly a huge issue with his 9 to Brunner and the nature of people's, how they read that and either don't read Barth or read Barth wrongly. And Torrance is trying to help us in this chapter to give us a sense of what he sees as Karl Barth's contribution here. And also to, well, the question, does he have really a new way forward? Paul Molnar did say, if I think Torrance is saying what I think he's saying, there's nothing new about it. He's just saying you have to do natural theology within revealed theology. And therefore, there's nothing about what is traditionally called natural theology about it. So anyway, we'll investigate all that today. Travis, I appreciate your handout and that you aren't attempting to have all the answers, but you're raising questions that you have so that we can not feel like we're sitting in on a lecture, but that we're engaging a conversation to try and further understand what Torrance is saying and how we might articulate to others who are trying to understand this, both to understand Barth and Torrance, but also just to get clarity on how do we go forward in the conversations we have about the nature of theology and science and the term natural theology within it. So that being said, as a preface, you have a wonderful, engagement with the text. So I'm going to follow a lot in your handout. You've followed the exact sections within the book. So, we can just jump from one to the other. They're nice little short essays. Ken has talked about the nature of T.F. Torrance liking to write short essays rather than long diatribes. And so we find, each one of these, in a sense, is an argument. And so we can ask the question, to what degree do these really satisfy us? And to what degree do we just not understand them? And we can help clarify that for one another. So you make an introductory note, just that you set out to summarize points. It became clear. I love that things become clear. I have a distinct take on this reading, and so I put them together. I put it together on this. And when you said distinct take,
Well,
are you
I
saying
just I
from your Torrance orientation?
no, okay. This is perhaps a ham-fisted taxonomy here. I generally, and like I said, I really haven't dived into the enough of the literature about natural theology and Torrance. This has been the main focus of my thing. So in my ham-fisted distinction, the way I see it is you have people like Paul Molnar who say essentially, T.F. Torrance disagrees with Barth on natural theology and is therefore wrong. Alistair McGrath says T.F. Torrance disagrees with Barth on natural theology and is correct to do so. My experience through seminary and in my reading of Torrance in the early days was perhaps strongly shaped by Elmer Collier, who is of the opinion that T.F. Torrance does not disagree with Barth on natural theology and is correct for that. So my take generally, so it's distinct in as much as I appreciate the fact that there are going to be differences of opinion within the larger Torrance crowd. My biggest complaint in this chapter is that why, oh, why, Tom, can you not just say, let's not do natural theology? That is the thing I keep waiting for him to just come out and say, and he doesn't. And that's my big frustration throughout it. But I appreciate the fact that there's going to be other people who are going to say he doesn't say that because that's not what he means. But so just I found myself going beyond Torrance a couple places, sharing my own thoughts and perspectives on things. And so I realized this is no longer really a summary. I don't want to make it seem as though I'm actually summarizing Torrance. I'm mostly responding to. So I start off with these things with an idea, and then it goes out the window. And I've had a couple crazy weeks, and so this is the time I could spend to do it. And so this is what it looks like.
So I love that about you. And my why oh why is, why can't you just say it's a theology of nature and not natural
Right.
theology? To just switch
Right.
those words, I think brings them into alignment. So that'll be the question I ask: is why we held on to the order of natural
Hmm.
theology instead of a theology of nature, which I think is what I heard Torrance in the end saying here. But we would need to clarify, what do different people mean by natural theology, and how do we clarify what each of these authors is saying by it? Because we've listed some great people here, and so to assume that all of them mean the same thing when they say natural
Hmm.
theology is probably too a priori rather than a posteriori, which is required for this discussion. So anyway, we're grateful for your querying instead of just an attempt to summarize. So introductory section. So in this introductory section, Torrance introduces the idea of dualism. So we just want to be clear for people who don't know how Torrance is using the word dualism with respect to the term natural theology. Because dualism can mean all kinds of things, but it's setting the context for particular things. So just clarify dualism with respect to the term natural theology. You're now on
I thought
mute.
I clicked unmute, but I had not.
Yeah, you had become
Um,
dualistically separate from us.
so he used this example that he uses elsewhere, although I think this is probably earlier than I know. I thought about going through my notes and finding cross references, but I decided that was not going to be the timely use of getting this out. I know he uses it in Preaching Christ Today, which is a relatively late, at least publication of his, where he talks about the idea of seeing the world as separate or interacting with the world of the intelligible. And so what he's saying here is not necessarily, I don't think that natural theology, he's interpreting dualism from that point of view. I think what he's trying to say is that if we believe that there really is an overlap between, to put it crudely, our world versus God's world, if there is an overlap in the person of Jesus, then natural theology is not helpful and therefore not really possible. And that in order to function with natural theology, in order to pursue it, you have to presuppose that there's a separation, because if there was overlap, that's where we should be going, to understand. So it's not necessarily that, so he's trying to say once again, because again, Torrance has been critiqued for making dualism an issue for everything. But his point seems to be, if there is not a dualism, then natural theology is not helpful. And if you are engaging in natural theology and it's anything like the traditional sense, you're basically assuming that there is a separation. And so he's drawing attention here about how Barth's early thought could be seen as leaning in a dualistic direction by drawing on the infinite qualitative difference between God and creation. And so he's just trying to introduce this idea of, what are we assuming about the relationship between God and creation, and what will that do to shape the rest of the discussion?
The one thing just to add to that is there is this third option where people say, of course, there's a place where God wants to be known, but there also are ways outside of that. And many of the textbooks that I read, particularly undergraduate, had a chapter on general revelation to begin with. So general revelation is just a code word that doesn't make it overt upfront for natural theology, that we can somehow, through the nature of the order and structure of the world, come to know God. So it's assuming this third way. And of course, Psalm 19, Romans 1:18 following. These are the texts that are gone to. I've had students jump on me for
Mhm.
dismissing it. They go to these biblical texts and say, but you're not following the Bible, right? So this third way is something also that we have to ask about the nature of how we maintain a biblical witness that becomes, shall we say, exclusive in the way Barth and Torrance are saying, that that says there's a problem with what is called general revelation and the fact that so many, at least undergraduate, and maybe just to say non-influenced by the Barth tradition, still want to hold on to general revelation, meaning it's still very popular to hold on to the concepts of natural theology, but not call it that. So people just think, oh yeah, it's just general revelation,
Right.
right?
Well, and so the issue also with like the Psalms is, so what are, yes, the Psalms absolutely unquestionably describe some sense of being aware of God's majesty through these various things. The question, of course, is, are they saying essentially anyone who looks at creation will come to these concrete conclusions about who God is, or are they saying we are coming to this observation already knowing who God is, already knowing the story, already having this relationship of being liberated and shaped and formed, and now we can see what's there in a way that somebody else outside of that could not. And I think that the question, of course, rises is what exactly are these biblical texts saying about our human capacity? And I also would argue that I think that well, even Romans 1, I think is highlighting what we don't do well more than what we do. But you're right. You're right. There's that strong. I've taught intro to theology now to enough people to know that there's a general. I think that most people who haven't given it much thought instinctively say, "Well, of course, there's natural theology. Of course, there's general revelation," and um, which is not to say our intuitions are always wrong, but I think they need to be at least probed to find out what are we really assuming when we come to those conclusions.
Yeah. Which is to say, any person you look at, you quickly identify, oh, you're male or female, oh, you're somewhat in this age, therefore you must be like this. That we automatically read people based on observation without knowing anything about them. And in a sense,
Right.
that is doing natural theology. It is the
Sure.
categorization based on the experience that we have through observation without really knowing the person at all. So there's a strong corollary there. The nature of beauty and such forth like that, again, they think that, that I can read God, I see God in the sunsets, I see God in the stars. Um, the other question, just based on Barth's 4:3, where he talks about the nature of the Christ as the light that comes into the world, then the lesser lights. There's, at some level, there's a sense of here of what I would call a theology of nature that Barth is saying. When we look at the world, of course, God has created a beautiful world, and his glory is seen as the creator in the beauty of the world. But we have to see it within the light of Christ, that he is the one who made it. And we can see that what he makes has this capacity for beauty. But there are lesser lights that are working out from the nature of the person of Christ, which again, I would characterize this as Barth attempting to give us a theology of nature, that because we see Christ, we can see the world. And I think that Torrance is arguing for that towards the end of this chapter, but I wasn't exactly sure. He wasn't as overt as I would have liked him to have been. Have you read Barth on the Lesser Lights at all?
Well, I've read through the dogmatics, but not closely and carefully enough to be able to
Yes.
cite that at this moment.
Right. So for you, they're just little twinkling stars in the night, and that is fine. So, anyways, it all brings us
I'm in 4:1 right now. I think that's where
okay.
I'm in my read through again. So a
Right.
little behind
The
that.
light is coming. Yes, you are in the far country
Right.
where natural theology usually has bad consequences and needs a judge who is judged in our place.
Mm.
So again, this idea in the introduction of dualism there is just a basic division of the created world from God, that there is a
Mm.
sense in which, how we say that we know who God is and how we know the world apart from God these lines can be easily crossed. There is an appropriateness to holding them distinct. God is not the creation. God should not be pantheistically seen to be the creation or panentheistically to be within the creation somehow, but that God is the creator and the creation is what God creates. But if we're going to know God, we can't understand it through the creation itself. We have to understand it through God, letting God's self be known. But there's a duality, I think is Torrance's word here. There's a duality of God and what God creates. They exist, but we can only understand that which is created by understanding the creator.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Sure.
Yeah. So in the sequence of everything that Barth and Torrance do to say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, requires, in knowing that God is already in verse 1, dealing with the nature of creation. So we have some, and I could use the word license here, or maybe it's even stronger, some compelling to understand if God is the creator of this world, what do we understand about God and God as the creator that leads us into the discussion we're having today? Is that a fair sense that there is something compelling about the opening of Genesis 1 as well as John chapter 1 that says it's appropriate to think about the God creation relation, and this discussion is trying to clarify it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's I think this idea of as somebody who is inclined to call natural theology in its traditional form glorified idolatry. I mean, there's a reason why it keeps coming up. There's a reason why it continues to be a compelling line of thought. It's not for nothing. You know, there's definitely a silent crying out for explanation. Um, but so yeah, I think it's a reasonable thing to raise the question as to how is God related to this creation.
Right. In your second paragraph in the introduction, this dress was interpreted by some being dualistic in nature, even accusing Barth of Marcionism and deism. So those are not necessarily for everyone natural terms to see the dualistic implications. Can you just quickly unpack the implication of Marcionism and deism with regards to dualism?
Well, I'll tell you how I read it anyway. Um, Marcion had a dualism between the creator and the redeemer. Essentially God of the Old Testament, God of the New Testament, demiurge versus Christ. Um, and then deism, has essentially it is the interactionist in the most anemic sense of the word. That there's a creator in the sense of God creation built, got it spin up and running, and then that's it. No interaction ever again for any reason. And so that kind of one of those things where it's almost like at that point these two. So I'm making this shape because in another use of this, he describes them as being like overlapping hemispheres. That's why I think of it as hemispheres. It's almost like the deist view, says bump. There's one tiny little bump once upon a time, and then never again. Now today there definitely is no interaction. There's definitely no Jesus crossing over from one to the other. Yeah, that's definitely not the case for deists.
And
So
what's
that's my
your
read.
model for the Marcionite? If you've got the bumping moment there, what's your picture of the Marcionite position?
Well, I'm not. I mean, we're talking about two different worlds to a certain degree. We have almost like we might have the creator creation, and then you actually have this third one over here. That one might cross over, but it's got nothing to do with God, or vice versa, or that God's not got nothing to do with that. It all depends on how you interpret the demiurge, of the early Gnosticism and all the rest. But that's at least my reading. That's my shooting from the hip thought.
When Tom was lecturing on this back in the 70s, he was trying to make the point that every good theologian always needs to be able to make distinctions, sometimes wide distinctions, narrow distinctions, sometimes just differentiations, contrasts, before and after things. Dualism as an ism, at its worst, bifurcates the universe into light and dark, high and low, holy and obscene. It is truly superstitious and shot through with anxiety and fear and hyperbolic claims for humanity and for spirits and all that kind of stuff. So he was always pointing to a phrase he found in one of the early, one of the patristic theologians he was working with at the time. They say that Marcion, who was addressed, we hardly know anything about Marcion himself. We only know what Irenaeus says about him in what is his joke book of the early paganisms, is against the heresies. And the point that Tom was making is that Irenaeus could treat most of these Gnostic heresies as cosmic jokes. They made obvious mistakes, amateur mistakes, the kinds of pitfalls that armchair philosophers and street corner preachers make. It is not a serious argument about towards what is the reality of the universe and how we relate to us. He says, now contrast that to how the church responded to Arius. The question is not dealing with deism, because there was no, it's an anachronistic word here. Nobody used that word. We get to deism when we get to Isaac Newton. After theological science, I think Tom got a little more casual about using the term because we still use it now. But nobody at the days of Athanasius was worried about deism. They was worried about Arianism, because with Arianism, even the little bump that Travis was describing did not occur, could not occur by the very nature of who God is and what the universe is. They are utterly and totally incompatible. Now, that's not just a duality. That is dualism. When that has become the first premise of most of your philosophical and theological working out of things, you cannot have Jesus, and you cannot have the covenant, and you cannot have a good creation. Almost everything falls. See, so now you can see, he said, why the church of Athanasius's day reacted rather rapidly to come to a consensus and say, no, we cannot have this, we cannot have that, we cannot have that. And Arius was excluded. He only got 2 votes in the Council of Nicaea. And nobody, all sorts of theologians have tried to go back and re-explore Arius. I'm pretty sure he was a nice kid and took care of his mom, and it was great with puppies and kittens. But as a theologian, he had this fatal flaw. I guess as a historian, I got to qualify this. We have very little of Arius's material ourselves because he went into exile, he died, and the church did a pretty good job of burning his materials. But he had his defenders, and they tended to publish a lot. But not getting into that, to Travis's point, the word dualism here, once we've defined it for our own use, let's try to stick to that use, because otherwise we're just going to go all over the place. And one of the things we did
you would use is what? What would you use in light of Tom's definition of it?
Tom in theological science is talking about intellectual errors that split things that ought not to be split.
Okay.
So that you've created duality between light and dark, or good and bad, light that is a wave and light that is a particle. Even making that distinction, if you insist that it must be a wave or a particle, you're thinking dualistically. It has to be one or the other. It can't be both. But if you can think them together, you're thinking in a unitary way. You're not being dualistic, and you can go ahead and use whatever terms you like. But in that context, he was always looking at Isaac Newton, who kept insisting that space and time exist in a defined sphere and do not change. And so the ability for them to interact with us and us with them was a intellectual dualism that crippled the scientific revolution and stopped development for some time. It took a while to repair that mess, because it was intellectually repairable. Indicates that it is a secondary kind of dualism. It is not a primary kind, not a kind that is fatal to all philosophy and fatal to all theology, whereas Arianism was. So if you want to let Athanasius define dualism, you're talking about a fundamental faith discernment that can only be replied to with a confession that there is a God, and Jesus is the Son of God. That is the only way Athanasius could approach it. But if you want some of the lesser dualisms, Anselm will help, and you can patch up a lot of these things. And that is really, in the history of the church, is most of the problems we have had. And Tom will occasionally fire off an accusation it's a dualism in this almost household definition of dualism. It just means you're thinking sloppy. Tidy up your definitions, clean up your thinking, work this out, and you will be able to straighten this mess without much further going. And that is where last week with Paul we were talking about when Tom takes the example of Euclidean and non-Euclidean geometry to Barth and says, you see how it is possible to repair some functional dualisms by rethinking your premises, like the physicists did with Einstein and his theory of relativity. Theologians can do that kind of thing too. And not to get too far ahead, because I'm not sure, I didn't get a chance to finish Travis's document. I mean, maybe we'll go back to that. But that is where I think you're seeing a real theological engagement taking place between several competent theologians. That's Paul and Bart and Tom and Travis. So why not?
Wow.
Got to take a bow. That this, because it's urgent, because it matters. Because if you don't, St. Athanasius is going to jump down off the wall and come over and kick you in your Arian can. You really, really do need to think this through. But there are plenty of other silly little dualisms. As we're coming up on Halloween, the number of silly little superstitions that have been perpetuated by silly little contrasts that turned into dualities, that turned into doggone superstitions, so that the devil in all of his works goes flighting about in the night, and the dead are the dead, the living are the living. All that theological rubbish is made from sloppy thinking, but it is not traceable back to an Arian heresy. Leastwise, not for me. I might go on and talk about the medieval Manichees, oh, come on. The heresy in the south of France. That in the late Middle Ages, they were at the time called the medieval Manichees. Manichaeism would be another. Those are ones that the church has had to consolidate and say, no. Beyond here, we cannot go. You crossed a boundary. Albigensians, that's the name.
If they had bowls of candy sitting at their door, though, they probably would have won the day.
I'm sorry, Marty.
I said if they had bowls of candy sitting at the door, they probably would have won the day.
A bowl of candy could solve all our theological problems.
It just seduces
yeah.
children.
M&Ms would be a golden treasure. I'm just illustrating that there is a superstitious streak even in modern American culture. So that we have horror movie after horror movie after horror movie that suggests or sometimes demands that we believe that the world as we see it, full of sun and light and love and health, is a fraud. And underneath, the real creation is a product of the Manichaean terror. It is full of death and disease and destruction, and we are all trapped in it, and nobody can escape. That is heresy.
And so the nature of the conversation in natural theology just leads into the question, how do we interpret the world and God's relation to it? And if you don't get it right, you open up to all these other errors. They are all possible. And the gate could be the word dualism, and you walk through it and discover that you're in a kind of hell, but it's a hell made up by the human imagination.
and like in Alice in Wonderland, each of the one of these gates gets bigger or smaller depending on the size of your brain.
Right.
I keep William Paley's Natural Theology on my bookshelf.
Mm.
William Paley is we're almost harmless. I mean, it's an intellectually amusing thing by somebody who is already convinced of the Christian truth and plays with illustrations of how things in nature can be parables of things in the spiritual world. We I can tolerate that. I find it a little tedious, and after a while, I throw it back into Irenaeus's joke book of theology, and I don't worry about it anymore. I got Nazis to worry about. All right, so I'm not worried about a watch clock universe.
Thank you, Karl, and thank you for not being Richard Dawkins, who wants to take everything apart for another conclusion.
Yeah, I'm going to
So
be
the
as
nature
excited when
of
he's
the
dying.
the nature of the problem then in this introductory thing is just we have a false understanding of reality, therefore our interpretations become problematic. And at some level, the question of how natural theology plays into that is a basic error that can be the starting point for coming to a Y in the road and going the wrong way. And the road less traveled, I think, is the road of revelation. The road more traveled is the road of the natural inclination to interpret based on one's instincts or sensibilities or something like that would be maybe a word. So your last sentence in your first paragraph, this provoked other criticisms, which of course, just begs that, well, what is Travis thinking about there?
I just wasn't going to enumerate the ones that he said again. It was for
Okay.
sake of
So it's
occasionalism.
the ones that follow from this that you're pointing to.
Yeah.
It just looked like a side, here's a rest stop if you want to just think about something else. So anyway, I just wanted to make sure not to miss
Oh,
the rest stop.
Bill had his hand up.
Oh,
I was
Bill.
just curious, Travis, your book, Encountering Reality, you touch on dualism quite a bit throughout.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. In one context of Kataphysine, you end your little intro paragraph by saying unpacking this conviction will allow for an evaluation of whether Torrance, for all this dislike of dualism, might be
Right.
harboring might be harboring some dualistic tendencies of his own.
Right. So from my perspective, I believe that how I take that up later on is to say that is an accusation that gets made of Torrance. Torrance is accused of being a dualist. And I do want to clarify there's a couple of places where he says there are to be against dualism does not mean that we're necessarily against a proper duality. Yes, we've made that distinction here, where there is a distinction between God and humanity, but there's not what he called the charismos between the cosmos noetas, the cosmos aistatos, the intelligible world and sensible world. So to a certain degree, that's my question of trying to trace the fact of Torrance has been accused of being dualist, of protesting too much. So we're going to take it up. We're going to look at it. We're going to see if it holds water and all the rest. So I think generally speaking, the answer here is no, but I also do understand why somebody could come to that conclusion, why someone might suggest that about Torrance.
Thank you.
Good. Thanks for that clarification. So in your first paragraph under rejection of dualism, you begin by wanting to reflect on a particular statement. So help us.
I did, and also apparently I typed it out badly, or there was autocorrect because I'm not sure how in the world the word rhetoric got in there. I didn't notice it. I must not have proofread very well. So let me see if I can find the actual thing here. What's the start? So just as, is that right? So just as God's being. So just as God's being cannot be abstracted from his act, for God is who he is in his act, so his being cannot be abstracted from his word, for he is who he is in his word. Thus, any natural theology would have to establish itself on the ground of a dualism between God's being and his active word, while interactionism, grounded in the unity of being, act, and word in God, would have to question whether such a natural theology ever reaches the real God, whose living existence includes his speaking and acting. So, well, what were you going to say? And So it seems to be like, yeah. How I read this is to say, like, if we're trying to abstract God from His Word, right? We're trying to say, yeah, we've got His Word, and we got to somehow think about something else that's not God's Word. If we're abstracting from God's Word, we're saying, well, God's Word is over here, but what we actually want to know is God who's over here, and they're not necessarily really related in any way. If you try to abstract that, you have cut, Jesus off from God. And the moment you've done that, then the only thing you can do at that point is do some kind of natural theology, because now you cut off any actual interactionism between God and creation. In which case, the question is raised: we end up. Does it ever reach the real God? I mean, and this is actually something that in some ways he brings us up like 3 or 4 more times throughout the course of this chapter, where later on he makes it overtly Trinitarian, where it says, if God is triune, and our natural theology does not robustly demonstrate that God is triune, then whatever it's done, it has not actually led us to God. It's led us to something else. My take is he's making essentially the same point here, which is if we're trying to say, yeah, God has done these things, God said these things, well, what's God really like? Then we have basically shut the only door by which we can really go through to reach God.
With Augustine, with his sense of the Trinity as will, understanding, and memory, I think it is taking the human as that there's something about the way we are that we can observe these elements, and therefore God as Trinity may reflect that. I think that's the argument that people say. Some people like it because it's like, oh, I get that in human, I get my will, I get but with what he's making a statement here is to say, you have taken the world, especially the nature of your human experience, and made God in the image of that. And so it's no longer actually connected to it. You are, to use the term Athanasius used of Arius, you're mythologizing, you're projecting onto God something of the experience of yourself. Is that kind of what he's looking at here?
I mean, so again, like I said, I was trying to figure out what the details here about, it to me, I think what he's, again, part of my recurring frustration in this chapter has been, it seems like you want to say X. Why don't you just say X instead of, talking around this other way here? It seems like what you want to say is natural theology. And so this, I made a comment here in my second paragraph of this section, talking about, he'll use the example of Fermat's principle when it comes to the path of light. Path actually takes this light. That is the shortest distance. To say, well, but what if it had taken a different path? Well, it didn't, because it's not the shortest distance. Therefore, there is no other shortest distance to find. And so when it refracts or when it bends or when it does all these things, it's still the shortest distance. And so, what I kind of want to say is, in the same way, I want him to say, the way is through Christ, and then any other attempt to try to bypass that or cut it off and say, well, that's fine, but let's see what we can find out if we go this other way, is just as silly as to say, well, we're going to find this other maybe there's a shorter path out there other than the path that light has actually taken. And what we'll find is that, in fact, no, there isn't. In which case, I think he goes, I appreciate why, to a certain degree, you can't just come out and say that, especially at this part of the chapter. But that is kind of my wondering of, I feel like he is being unnecessarily verbose, which is not actually what I usually think of Torrance. But it's possible. This is one of the few books by Torrance I don't actually own. I had to get a scan of this, and so it's possible if I spent more time in it, I would crawl inside and understand the internal logic better than I do.
Yeah.
So I'm not assuming I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I think it's an important book. You just want a Google Maps that gets you to your destination and not telling you all the ways you could have gone but shouldn't have gone because you get lost.
Well, and that I think is where I'm going to come out later on, where I want Torrance to just say, which obviously he did not, otherwise we wouldn't have the ongoing debates that we've got. I wanted to say, like he says, well, the problem with natural theology is not that it can't exist, but it can't be independent. Like, okay, fine, great, fantastic. What do you mean by a non-independent natural theology, and how is that even closely related to anything that's gone by that name throughout history? And so, I'm to say we can't have. So this is, after I said this out to you, I was reviewing the chapter again, and I was thinking about a conversation I had with a friend of mine, and we disagreed on the topic of whether or not we should think of the Bible as inerrant. I am hesitant to use that word to describe the Bible because of all the baggage that has gone along with that word and how it's been used in twist and art. And so the question he asked me was, okay, Travis, what parts of the Bible do you not like? What parts of the Bible do you think are inaccurate? What parts of your Bible do you think are not historically reliable? And I'm glad he asked that question because I realize we are not looking at this question the same way. Because it seems to me that he keeps encountering people who want to deny the inerrancy of the Bible because there are places they don't like. That if we say, well, hang on, I don't like what this says, so I'm going to say that's not reliable, so I can be free, to just ignore it. And what I was realizing was that's not at all my perspective at all. And I was thinking about the marvelous thing that Barth says, and this is in 1-2. Is it 1-2? I wrote it down. I wrote a reference down. Yeah, 1-2. Where he talks about this this bolder comment that it's not the inerrancy of the text that is the miracle. It's the fact that God takes broken and human people and speaks the reliable word of God through them anyway. That is the miracle. And I realized, that my point is to say, at some point to say, I wonder if maybe Torrance is trying to do something like that, where he wants to try to say, you're not crazy for wanting a natural theology. It's not an unreasonable idea that we might be able to pursue one of those things. If you're taking the doctrine of creation extraordinarily seriously and downplaying the doctrine of the fall, then it's a reasonable thing to say we must be able to see God's imprint, fingerprint on these different things, to the point where even if you don't know who Jesus is, you might be able to know something about who God is. It's not crazy. And my point to say, I think that what Torrance might be trying to say, and I'm not sure about this, but it's like he keeps saying, well, Barth's not trying to deny a natural theology. I think that we try to say he's like, Barth's not like mad at natural theology. Like he didn't say, I'm going to come out and it's not that I have certain aspects of natural theology that I want to reject. He just simply says, if we are taking the incarnation seriously, natural theology is a thing that should never happen. And the fact that it does happen is an indictment on us, because the moment we start doing our natural theology, we have quietly or loudly, but at least quietly said, we're not going to look where we know we can find God. We're going to come to conclusions about God from somewhere else. And then maybe if we're trying to be at least remotely biblical, we're going to try to shove what Jesus reveals about God, into that box that we've created. So we've already determined that God's immutable. Well, here's a problem. God became flesh, took on flesh and lived among us. So now we have a choice. Either we have to say that Jesus isn't God because God doesn't change, or you have to dramatically reinterpret what you mean by immutable, in which case, are we talking about the same thing anymore? So in the same way, here we are talking about natural theology, and my reading of Torrance is trying to say, we don't have to get rid of natural theology so long as we bring it into the heart of revealed theology. Well, great. But I think that history would say, and I'm not an expert, I mean, my gut is to say that history would not recognize that. Like if you could say, oh yeah, we can do natural theology as long as we are coming directly and overtly from self-revelation of God in Jesus Christ. I think that the people who were doing natural theology would say, that's exactly what we're trying not to do. So I don't know. I feel like Torrance's conclusions lead us to say, as strong as the 9. But not so sure why he wants to be so reluctant to say that. Unless he's trying to say, he's not necessarily attacking natural theology. He just thinks it reveals that we're being stupid. That we're being, deliberately stupid in the sense of, in the technical sense of we're not just simply unknowing. We are deliberately making choices that are against what we should know. That was a different rant than I was necessarily.
Yeah, there's a sense in which I'm just thinking of the Google Maps illustration. If you're going somewhere and your app will tell you where the beautiful trees are along the way, or if it tells you the geologic structure of the place you're going through, you're still going to the same place, but you're getting insight as to things you go along the way. The story of how that road got built, it could tell you all these things. And so it's not changing your direction, it's just providing insight. And so to say the nature of the natural sciences is that they select things to pay attention to and give descriptions of those things, but without making them competitive to the nature of where it is that you're going. So I'm wondering if Torrance's overall sense of including the sciences is this dimension of, as long as we know where we're going and we know that we've listened to an authoritative statement about where we're going, we can notice the things along the way and the history and all that. We just can't make them authoritative. They just help us to see and to hear things along the way in the natural world.
It's interesting because I'm wondering if maybe this is revelatory of how I might not be reading Torrance in quite exactly the same way that other people are, or maybe it is the same. I'm not sure,
Maybe
but
everybody reads them differently.
but what I mean by that is that how I read Torrance's emphasis on the natural theology is the consequence of his absolute rejection of natural theology. Because this idea of if you were a pantheist, natural science, we would pursue natural. Well, okay, all right. I appreciate the fact that it did not arise during that kind of thing. This is a completely fabricated thought experiment here. Okay, if you were a pantheist and you really believed everything you saw was God, was an emanation of God, you would study it very carefully because you want to know God. Natural science and theology have become one of the same discipline. And for Torrance, it is. I read Torrance as being so radically an advocate for natural theology precisely because it's not theology. It's precisely because we cannot assume that there's a necessary relationship. We have to assume there's not a necessary relationship between God and the creation, which means we have to look at it on its own grounds, on its own terms, in its own rationality. That yes, you could say metaphysically is dependent on the order of God, but not in any way that we can kind of read backwards into who God is from what we see. And so again, so when I read him talk about like a theology of nature, I'm reading that as saying, yes, by understanding your theology of nature the way you do is perhaps the strongest assumption. The only way you can proceed with that kind of theology of nature is if you have categorically rejected using the created universe as a means to know God in any meaningful sense. Now we can bring our theology and interpret it that way. So it's fascinating because I hear, and again, I have not gotten deep into like exactly all of what Alistair McGrath means by this theology of nature. But I always have found the idea of, natural theology is basically a theology of nature. And I almost say those are almost as far apart in my mind as you can possibly get. Now, I'm not assuming I'm necessarily correct on that because natural theology in a positive sense doesn't really show up in my context in parish ministry. But
I think one is dating through checking boxes on Kinder, and the other is actually meeting somebody and getting to know each other with 5 or 6 dates and getting to know them. One is purely categorical without really knowing the person, and the other is that which one knows by virtue of meeting and actually engaging the other. So radically different would be probably what I would say as well.
Mhm.
Well, Marty, you actually call natural theology, you likened it to playing Monopoly in CD in your book. What was it, number 2? I thought that was interesting. You say natural theology goes on to play Monopoly with the truth about God and humans as it takes over the board and defaults to human values and perspectives. If truth is self-evident to a person, why consider another option?
Mm.
So that's based on, you'll have to excuse my German, but Mach und Mono, what's the word for monopoly? The German word? But anyway,
I
Barth
can't bring it
used
up.
that, right?
Yeah. And again, all of that book, I sit and I read Barth and I attempt to summarize it in a way that we can visualize. And so the idea of monopoly, you're trying to take over the board,
Mm.
right? That's the idea. And so natural theology is used to try and make sense of God and the world for one's own purposes, which is basically corollary to the game of Monopoly.
In,
Well,
in, a, in a very serious way.
In a very serious way.
Barth meant it. He didn't mean it as in a joking game way. He meant it really quite serious. It's a serious thing.
Yeah.
Right?
He is seriously joyful in his exploration of the ways that we even mess up. I mean, Barth just won't let himself be taken as an angry, defiant, you must see it my way kind of person, but he wants to continually put the person of Christ and say, think this way, and you'll see that there is liberation and freedom. See this way, and you have everybody trying to control their world like you're playing a game of Monopoly, and virtually everybody loses. Nobody wins.
Yeah.
Well, so I go after this is a pet peeve of mine of the perfect being theology, and I think this idea is so I get really frustrated. So there's there was a late Methodist theologian named Tom Oden who published a systematic theology that has been republished from 3 volumes to one, called Classic Christianity. And at one point, like he's almost done with volume 1, where he's been doing a lot of trying to introduce you to the great tradition of the church, the early Christian writers, and all the rest. And so he's talked about attributes of God and all these different things like that. And then, like 3/4 or more of the way through the first volume, he says, "There's really nothing we can say without looking at Jesus." And I said, "Really? Because you wrote your whole first part of your book without that at all." And the problem that I have with that is so oftentimes to say, "Okay, congratulations, we've established a lot about God without ever looking to Jesus." I was recently looking again at the Westminster Catechism. And, we talk about who God is. We name the Trinity, but before we talk about who Jesus is, before we talk about any of the things that are actually concrete, we start saying, what are the decrees of God? What do those mean? And we've established this is the kind of God that God is. So now we've already established that. Now we got to find some way to shoehorn Jesus in there. And guess what? It's not easy to do. You get weird things. So once you've established that God is this perfect being, omniscient, omnipotent, and we determine those terms in the abstract, now we have to try to make sense out of God in Christ. And we realize, it doesn't fit at all. But the problem is, because we started with that perfect being, and we'll say things like, well, all truth is God's truth, which is trivially true, but that doesn't necessarily, that implies to say, well, because we came up with this idea independent of Jesus that we think might be true, then therefore it's God's truth. Well, no. And in the same way, if you say, we'll bring natural theology into our conversation. Okay, so you either started with natural theology, in which case you're going to be constantly trying to fit what you see about Jesus into that, which will never work. Or you start with Jesus, you start with Trinitarian theology, you start with overt revelation, and then you say, well, then we'll bring natural theology along. Well, the problem, of course, is then what you find in natural theology doesn't match up with that at all, and so you may as well not do it at that point. That's from a practical point of view, that's where I get frustrated with some of that stuff, where it's like, what are you hoping to achieve with natural theology? Because we're trying to say, well, we want to convince people who are not yet Christians, or who are from other people, that if they look to the universe, they're going to understand who God is, or they're going to admit that there was a God. And it's like, I don't know that that's necessarily a win. It's certainly not an evangelistic win. If I find somebody who's an atheist, and I use arguments like the anthropic principle and a couple of those things, and somehow they say, oh my goodness, you're right, it is too complicated. Oh my goodness, it's amazing that there's something rather than nothing, all the rest. There must have been a God. Okay, but how have I convinced them of anything like the gospel? Or have I simply made them into a deist? Or a pantheist, or a panentheist?
Yeah.
And I mean, and maybe I am shaping their perspective in this conversation. I don't know that even if a natural theology does everything it hopes to do, I just don't know that is a real goal for Christianity and for the gospel. And this is not me talking about Torrance or Barth. This is just me and my pet
That's a good
peeves.
question, and this is a reading group, and we have these questions.
Well, and I think about this. I think about it because and I live in a relatively religiously isolated community. I mean, what I mean is that to the degree there is religious life anywhere around where I live, it is some form or another of Christian. But you go to any place where there's any kind of religious, genuine, honest to God religious pluralism, not just different stripes of Lutheranism, then you're going to have people lots of theistic people who are not Christians. And I wonder if you live in a properly cosmopolitan area, which some of you may, is there that same desire to do natural theology in a way that there seems to be when you're in a more or less, homogenous, we're all basically Christians here. So therefore, if I convince you of the existence of God, we're talking about the Christian God, which can't be taken for granted in other places.
So in the book, I'm working on Karl Barth and creation care, to say, God creates the world, and he creates us, and he creates the world for us to live in. And there is a sense in which God, creating the ecosystems and the space within which we live, he wants us to care about that which God has made for us to sustain us, and to care for it so that both it thrives and we thrive within it. But I would call this the theology of nature. We're just recognizing God's creative work is holistic, it's mutually interdependent, and so we can work these things out in ways that allow us to care for the world, but it's God's world, and it's part of God caring for us, but we also are invited to care as well. So that's just a different avenue. And I think there's a community close by to me called Circlewood, and it's the greening of theology. And they're wanting to say, if you think theologically about it, It's something that God gives us, and creation is groaning, waiting for God's redemption to be fulfilled, and we get to participate in that. So it is a care for humans, it's a care for the world. But I think that's a theology of nature that begins with
Right.
God and aligns with, and I get the sense that Torrance wants to do something like that. Bart does actually hint in that direction at points,
Mhm.
but he doesn't say it, I think, as overtly as what maybe Torrance does.
Well, so here's the thing. So we've already been at this for an hour, right? And so I want to jump ahead a little bit,
Yeah.
just because I think it's relevant to that situation about the issue of geometry and physics.
Okay.
Because I think I think that is. I don't know that Torrance is seeing it the way that I am,
Okay.
but how I read the analogy of geometry and physics to me is proving the point that I've been trying to make, whether well or badly here, which is, so it's true. So up for a long time, everybody used Euclid's geometry. It's the only thing that we knew. It seemed self-evidently obvious. One of the postulates seems way longer, more complicated than the others, and so there's a massive effort to try to prove it from the others. It turned out that they can't do that, and then they finally demonstrated, actually beyond a doubt, that in fact that fifth postulate is logically independent from the other two, and they know that because they can substitute it out with alternatives, which give us these non-Euclidean geometries. And so the fascinating part about it is that what that reveals to us is that, strictly speaking, Euclidean geometry is 100% artificial. It has nothing to do with the world in which we live, not technically. Now, it may be that we can make lots of calculations, we can build buildings, we can do all kinds of construction with Euclidean geometry, but that is a happy accident that we are in a non-Euclidean universe that is, at least, is you can make approximations that are there. But what we've said, though, is that my understanding, and there may be been further development since then, but I haven't heard of it. My understanding is that we're pretty well agreed that we do not live in a Euclidean universe. Which non-Euclidean universe we live in is not necessarily abundantly clear. But we don't live in a Euclidean one. So we all agree, essentially, that we don't live in Euclid's universe. So, great. Okay, so what Torrance seems to be trying to say is that natural theology is like Euclidean geometry, and revealed theology is like physics. Cool. All right, fine. That means so not a surprise. We will occasionally, engaging in natural theology, come to conclusions that, at a distance, if you squint your eyes, they kind of look a little bit similar. But when you actually get down to business, you realize that they are, one, not exactly the same, and two, not built on the same foundation. So what Torrance is saying is we can make geometry properly scientific if we bring it into the heart of physics. Fantastic. Let's do that. But the moment we do that, we have left Euclidean geometry and all of its precision and all of its, beauty behind, and we have made it something else. It is no longer, what it was. To make it from Euclidean to non-Euclidean, it's no longer Euclidean. We've had a category change. So the same way, yeah, great. Let's bring natural theology into the heart of revealed theology. But the second we do that, we're not talking about natural theology anymore. And that's the thing, that statement, that, to me, inescapable conclusion of what he's saying with this analogy, Torrance absolutely seems to refuse to say. And I don't know why. And there might be a good reason for it. There might be an apologetic reason for it. There might be a dialogical reason for it. But to me, and I think I remember raising the question once when Paul Mullner was in the conversation. And the sense that I got was he didn't like the idea that Euclidean geometry is still a system that can function on its own. And I don't remember now exactly how he pressed me on it. So I might not be doing justice to this now. So if he watches this later on and says, no, Travis, you still missed my point, then that's fine. But it seems to me that what we're saying is that Euclidean geometry is, then fundamentally, at its heart, it's a game. It might be a helpful game because it trains our minds. It might help us to see connections we might not otherwise see. We can leverage, the apparatus of geometry and mathematical proof, trains us to say, if we can take this for granted, we can get farther than you'd ever imagine that way. But at the end of the day, we have to realize the fact that all this stuff is an artificial world. And it's a coincidence that there's any resemblance whatsoever to a certain degree. And so in the same way, I think I make a comment here where it almost is like saying, yeah, here we go. Is my last paragraph was, no wonder natural theology is enticing to so many. It feels right. It seems powerful. We can show all of our intellectual work to connect one thing to the next. There's no mysteries. So it basically ends up being, a kind of idolatry, But of course it's compelling. And of course it's compelling because it's entirely on the this worldly side of the divide, which again brings us back to that dualism question. Natural theology, geometry works so long as we never step outside of, our reasonably small world. The second we step outside, we realize it doesn't work. In the same way, as long as we never actually look beyond, we don't actually expect there to be anything really beyond creation. As long as we don't think there's any interaction between the two, we can make an artificial natural theology. But at that point, whatever knowledge we have, it's not knowledge of God, it's knowledge of something else.
Which, just to go back to the 3 points he makes on 139, 140, the first one, profound objectivity, that is getting the first thing first. The reality of God is the profound objectivity. The Bloomharts were the ones that helped him to recognize that what he had been taught in his liberal tradition was bringing in other lenses that weren't profoundly objective, they were subjective. And so Barth had this objectivity that I think Torrance still holds on to. It's central to his work in theological science. The second point is that the word is grounded in God, and there is a reciprocity of knowledge that is there, but it arises from the nature of God's revelation, which again, both Torrance and Barth are going to be totally on board with that. And then point 3, that the incarnation is the point at which we begin to do theology generally. And so anything we do, quote unquote, scientifically has to derive from how God is known in the incarnation in the person of Christ. So that is theological science, in a nutshell. And so the overcoming of the dualism are these theological agreements between Barth and Torrance. So that then on 141, where he goes on to talk about Barth's attitude towards natural theology, he doesn't want to dismiss Barth, but he wants to ask the question of, where does it come from? And the problem is when it arises from the human on 142, that's when it becomes problematic, from human existence. The last sentence of the first paragraph, that is to say, the claim to a natural theology of God, as Barth understands it, cannot be separated out from the whole movement of man, in which he seeks to justify himself over against the grace of God, and which can only develop into a natural theology that is antithetical to knowledge of God as he really is. It is acts of revelation and grace. So he's clearly setting the nature of, once you have a dualism, it seems like automatic default is the human beginning to do the work of what you've called creating idolatries. Choose your flavor. We got 39 flavors today. Which one do you want? Is it thinking? Is it beauty? Which one do you want to read on to God? But they all have some level of this human beginning. So that when he goes on then to 143, by grace alone, we've made grace such a theological concept connected with salvation and giftedness that we don't think of grace with natural theology or as something to be understood within that conversation. So can you make the clarification of what is the point of understanding grace alone as it functions, and clarifying when are we doing natural theology and when are we doing a theology of nature?
Well, I think if we didn't know better, if we didn't know that salvation is by grace through faith, right? Salvation by works sounds awfully convincing. It seems reasonable. And in fact, I think that's part of the offense of the gospel is we're saying, no. It's not about what you do. What you do, on the one hand, has absolutely nothing to do with it at all. Now, as a Wesleyan, I want to say that what you do after that makes a difference, but that is not so much because you're doing anything as much as it is if you are genuinely following Jesus and you're genuinely indwelled by the Holy Spirit. There is no way your life will not reflect it. So this idea is, so at the end of the day, though, the idea of grace alone says, because this is how salvation happens, every other attempt to obtain salvation is illegitimate. It's out of line. Which in part of ways, this is kind of how I read Paul's letter to the Galatians, where it's almost like they're saying, yeah, Jesus is great. Faith is great, but doesn't it feel like you're kind of getting away with something? Doesn't it feel like it should be something more than this? Doesn't it feel like you should have to do some other stuff too? Well, have we got news for you? Have you read the Old Testament? The Old Testament talks about all kinds of things we're supposed to do. So keep Jesus. We like Jesus. Jesus is great, but we're going to do Jesus and. And the second they said Jesus and, they missed it, because it's not Jesus and, it's just Jesus. And so in the same way, though, so what the point, though, how I'm reading this is that salvation, by grace alone, is saying we would never have imagined that works were irrelevant, that works were not the point, if we didn't already have the statement of by faith alone, or by grace alone. It's in the same way, the very existence of grace, salvation by grace, then says everywhere else you look, doesn't matter how good it seems, it doesn't matter how much you'd like it, everywhere else you look is the wrong place, because this is the place, this is the one place. In the same way, we have Jesus interacting, by in the incarnation, we have God interacting with his creation. To say, well, we're going to look at nature first. We're going to try to find the knowledge of God from somewhere else other than Jesus. At its core, is essentially the same thing as trying to find salvation by something other than grace. You're looking for God where God cannot be found, and saying, well, we don't want to rely on. I mean, maybe so. I'm sorry, I'm going to go off a different thing, but I think it goes back to that Fermat's principle, which he doesn't mention in this chapter, of the path that light takes is the path. You can look the rest of your life to everywhere else, and you're not going to find it, because that's just not how light goes. In the same way, this is how knowledge of God arises. This is how salvation arises, and every look everywhere else is in the wrong direction and cannot be the right direction, because the existence of the one truth in this case demonstrates absolutely everything else as being illegitimate. So, yeah, that's how I'm reading the issue of what grace alone shows us.
If you were to be a church doctor, you'd say then any church that has some sense of conditionality, contract, you must do this in order to be loved and accepted. That's a symptom that would say you have a natural theology operating in your church, and the conditional forms that are in place here are the symptoms of an undergirding natural theology that God is something other than the God revealed in Jesus. You have some form of a contractual God, and that is simply a kind of a hidden form of natural theology.
I probably wouldn't use the word natural theology in that conversation. In
I know you
practice,
wouldn't, but to say that.
Well, but yeah, it's a similar error. To do natural theology is making a similar intellectual mistake, which is, as Ken was on us earlier. We're splitting something apart that should not be split. So we're splitting faith and works, grace and works. We're splitting revelation and creation, and that that's not expressed well. But we're making mutatis the same error in both cases.
Yes.
We are not looking we're not looking where truth can be found. So what are we going to find if we're looking where truth cannot be found? What a surprise when we only find falsehood.
Yeah. Well, I like to find the correlations of things, even though they're not identical, to say it's a symptom of it. To even say Old Testament, New Testament. Well, what's Testament? Last night in my class, I asked, what does Testament mean? One person came up with promise. The rest of them were all just, telling a story or a contract or something. Nobody had a sense of unconditional love as, a part of what's there. And so if you begin just reading the Bible as though it's just a story or a contract, then you're already beginning to read with lenses that are going to lead you into essentially natural theology kinds of ways of being, and we'll miss the point. So on 144, we go on to epistemological grounds. The question of a priori, a posteriori, to say, we use those terms with regard to the question of natural theology. When we are doing a posteriori versus a posteriori, just make that clarification for people who may not have heard why those terms matter for natural theology.
So Torrance makes a constant distinction between a priori and a posteriori work. And so the idea of a priori is you are making your conclusions before you have done the actual engagement, the actual investigation. So in this case, for example, I mentioned earlier the idea of perfect being theology, this idea of if we sit back in our armchairs and say, I'm not going to actually go and investigate God, I'm just going to think now, and I'm going to try to figure out what must God be like to be worthy of the name, to be worthy of worship. And so I conclude that that God must be really powerful. God must be limitless in knowledge. We're not basing that on anything we actually know to be true about God. We know it. We are concluding it based on our previous reflection. And so Torrance emphasizes that we do not function that way in the natural sciences. to say to somebody, well, what is the nature of matter? And if someone says, well, I've never seen matter, I've never investigated matter, I haven't done experiments on matter, I haven't learned anything about from other people who have done those things, I'm just going to sit back and think, what is that like? And I think to a certain degree, that's where we get a little bit of the pre-Socratic, philosophy. Like, we see some things are like earth, and some things are like air, and some are like water, and some are like fire. Those feel like they're more basic than everything else, and we make conclusions based on that. So in this case, the issue with a priori versus a posteriori investigation of God is: are we making conclusions about God after we have encountered God, after we have investigated God, after we've understood various things, or not? Which is why I take a bit of what do I say in my little thing here? I said, I'm not precisely sure I'm understanding the fine details, and maybe someone can help me out if I'm missing something, or that he's saying, because it says, it sometimes argue that Barth excludes natural theology only in the name of biblical revelation and faith in Christ, and not on epistemological grounds. And then he goes on at some length to explain that it is on epistemological grounds because of this emphasis on a posteriori investigations, et cetera. But I think the moment that we've said that, a posteriori based on what? Based on, I would argue, biblical revelation and faith in Christ. I don't know that he's saying something different. I think he's saying the same thing from an epistemological perspective rather than from an exegetical perspective. So I'm not sure I'm following. I would argue those are not two different things at their root, even if you express them differently. But I may be wrong about that. I may be missing something.
Yeah, when we say a priori, it's a judgment made before we've actually looked at what it is we're going to be studying. So a judgment made before, that's a prejudgment. And so to say, all a priori thinking is prejudiced. It's a assumed thing that is prejudiced based on your past experience, not looking at the thing at all. So the nature of a priori makes us natural theologians because we're not actually looking at what's there. We're reading on to something that is not actually there with our prejudices. So all prejudices correlate to the nature of what natural theology does. And so
I mean,
and Torrance as well are trying to clarify the world so that we're not prejudiced against God or humans or the nature of creation.
I'm wondering if it's slightly more nuanced than that, because I'm wondering if the parallel might be more like if I'm a biologist and I'm studying biological reality, and I am then saying, hang on, if this is what biology is, then I'm going to make conclusions about the nature of the physical universe based on that.
Yep.
And which is not on the surface an insane thing to do. You will probably get something that at least resembles that. At the same time, a physicist is going to come along and go, well, I see where you're coming from, but why don't we actually look at than you are, because you're always seeing physical reality embodied in a very particular way, in biology. I don't know that. This is me thinking this through in the moment. Because I think they would say, I think that a natural theologian would say, oh no, this isn't a posteriori thing. We're studying, creation, we're studying history, we're studying, all these other things. We're doing an investigation. And I think Torrance would say, but not the thing you say, not the thing you think you are. You think you're investigating God by doing that, but you're not.
Yeah, because you have a prejudice. You're bringing in a set of presuppositions. So, to say that the nature of investigating the non-personal world, i.e. rainbows and geology and things like that, they don't talk. The nature of investigating the personal, i.e. God, is that if you don't listen, then you're not going to be able to come up with conclusions that are true to the nature of God. You can only bring in your experience of what it means to be a human, which is infinitely qualitatively distinct in the one who we're investigating. So there is a nuance, a deeper sense with the nature of the personal than there is with the world of object. And so the nature of epistemology for studying the world is different than studying the nature of God. And that's the question of epistemological grounds. Only God can reveal God. So a posteriori, as you say, has to be based on the revelation of God in Christ, the nature of Scripture pointing to him. And so I don't see that there is a particular distinction. Your last sentence, though the incarnation and biblical witness, it is another angle showing how deep and complex the basic conviction is. but I'm not sure if it's really a different thing. I would say that both of them are basically saying the same thing. I can't sense something is radically different there.
I mean, I'm just trying to think about so if someone were to come at the issue of natural theology, I'm just trying to think about how if someone could start with the basic scientific conviction that we have to know things a posteriori, and they start from there just as a general perspective of the world before they've ever heard about God, before they've ever investigated God or any of those things, and then they bring that a posteriori conviction to bear on their investigation to understand to theology. I'm wondering if they would necessarily get to the same place unless they operate with the assumption that the a posteriori, like what they have to investigate to be properly a posteriori, is faith in Christ and the local witness. And then in that case, the same thing again. But I'm not sure that the epistemological position, if we shear it away from the theological conviction, is sufficient to explain what Barth's doing. That's why I say I'm not sure he's doing something different there. So I'm really hammering on that. I'm really grinding that axe, so to speak.
When he uses the word independent on page 146, independent is something that is a priori. It's an independent judgment a priori that hasn't considered the nature of the object of the study, whereas the nature of something that is interactive, his interaction with the world, there is something there of being known because of the interaction that one is then being taught. So to use Polanyi's sense of indwelling or on a heuristic journey, any of those would be corollary to the nature of doing the work in an a posteriori way because there is a reality determined that we are then investigating. So to say, if you use my word prejudice, but you don't have to, the discovery would be the correlate. So a priori is prejudicial and a posteriori is a discovery process. And he's saying we can only do proper theology with a discovery process. We may discover that God created the world and that the nature of God's creation has certain things that he claims about it. I mean, we could say night and day, is that something that we have to say, well, we can't say God created night and day. I mean, there are ways that the sun operates, but to say that God couldn't have done that would be making a statement that you just don't want to believe in God, probably. So there might be some basic things are going through the 12 books of the Science and Knowledge, the Frontiers of Science. The question people ask is, why is there something rather than nothing? One of the books, he says, why is there this something rather than nothing? Is really calling for a theological question of, is there a reason, knowing that God has claimed to be the creator and that Jesus comes to reveal his Father's creator, that he participates in it, that we can say then a posteriori, yes, there is something out of the world that is created by God the Father, through the Son, by the Spirit, that we have a Trinitarian foundation. What we do next, I'm not sure, but at least we're at a conversation now that has a theological grounding to it in a process of discovery.
And again, I just want to reiterate something I said before, is because of so the fascinating part is, on the one hand, Torrance wants to not affirm the dualism between God and creation, that there is an interaction. And yet at the same time, I think what's crucial here, and maybe this is what is bringing this a little bit full circle, is that outside of Jesus, outside of that deliberate interaction and self-revelation, there would be a separation between the two. That it's not, and that it's not necessarily, and you could argue, well, I mean, I'm trying to think about how it's not a point of contact, to use that language, because wasn't that part of the Barth and everything, a point of contact?
Yeah, that was exactly the point.
Like the point of contact is Jesus. So it's not a point of contact in creation in any kind of abstract sense. It is this point of contact. And I wonder if it would be funny if a lot of that debate depended on whether you're using the definite versus the indefinite article. And I don't, my German was never strong enough. I couldn't tell you if there's a difference between those two in German.
This goes on just with the next section, no independent natural theology. From this perspective, it becomes clear that what Barth objects to in natural theology is not its rational structure, but its independent character. And so that sense of the independent character, and we're about halfway down on the right side starts. That is why Barth can say that natural theology is included and brought into clear light within the theology of revelation. And so this is the question of the theology of nature, right?
Mhm.
For in the reality of divine grace, there is indeed the truth of the divine creation. In this sense, it is true that grace does not destroy, but completes it. The meaning of the word of God becomes manifest as it brings to light the buried and forgotten truth of the creation. So this was from a work in his 1920 to 28 period. I don't know that he changed his mind, but I think that Torrance is arguing here, even Barth included, that if you stick with the context of a theology of revelation, you can talk about the creation as Barth does in all of all of three actually, and it is within it, not independent.
Mm.
And so I think Torrance is trying to argue what he did is what I'm doing.
Mm. Well, yeah, that's the thing is, right? So if we start by saying, grace is not destroy nature but completes it. I appreciate the fact that Barth didn't love that slogan in the rise of Hitler's Germany,
Right.
which is reasonable, because I think the idea is that when you interpret that in an abstract sense, grace as this impersonal force out there does not destroy whatever nature that I label it as, but perfects it according to my understanding, is a disaster.
Yep.
But if we stay rooted and grounded in the gospel, rooted and grounded in the actual incarnation, we say, well, we do see that God, in fact, grace does not actually undo nature, but perfects it or completes it. But it's almost like that shift from being the abstract to concrete is almost to say we're using the same words, but we're not talking about the same thing anymore.
Exactly.
In the same way. So again, so I want to say is the moment we have taken natural theology and shoved it into the heart of revealed theology, it's not natural theology anymore. It's something else.
Right.
And so I think that the danger is, and so Barth was willing to say, let's not call it that. And I think Torrance just really wants to hang on to that term. And I don't know why.
Well, I hold on to the word person, which Barth had concerns about the word person because he thought it collapsed into the individual. And so people like Alan Torrance in his doctorate, persons in communion, are saying, let's not lose the word. It is a helpful distinguishing word. And I think Torrance is saying, let's not lose, though I wish he would have said a theology of nature, because I think it keeps the same words and just flips the order and does the work that needs to be done. So I don't know why he didn't do that.
Mhm.
At the bottom of 147, the sentence begins, in other words, while our knowledge of him is grounded in God's own intelligible revelation to us, so there's our foundation a posteriori, it requires for its actualization an appropriate rational structure in our cognizing of it, but that rational structure does not arise within us unless we allow our minds to fall under the compulsion of God's being, who he really is in the act of his self-revelation and grace, and which as such cannot be derived from an analysis by our autonomous subjectivity. I think that Torrance there is shutting out what Barth wants to shut out and saying, if you go with something that's independent, you're just on the wrong road. But we can't say that Barth or the Bible doesn't speak about the created world in such a way that it's appropriate for us to investigate, care for it. Even one could say that the caregiving role of Adam and Eve in the garden was at some level to know, name, and care for the world. And that could be a justification. Yes, it's God's world, and yes, you've been given a role to be involved in it in a way that is, essentially a caregiving way, not to dominate for your own purposes, which would be a natural theology kind of way of reading that. So we've looked at the geometry and physics, and I was just wondering, Young Il, you are a master of these things. If you wanted to add anything to that conversation, I know that mathematics and geometry and things are your four aces in the hole. Did you want to add anything to that conversation?
Well, and Kenneth has himself unmuted, so I'm assuming he has something to say.
I think his I mean, Torrance's exposition there that geometry has become a part of natural science, I think is very valid. And I would say that, but one comment that Trevor made about Euclidean, I think it was also born from experience, right? I don't think that, I mean, we see Euclidean geometry as an abstraction of the world that we currently live. And that's why it's kind of, I think it's natural in that sense. So it's scientific in that sense. I think the danger is that I think in the 19th century, with the advent of abstract mathematics, and especially set theory and things like that, mathematics has taken on a idealistic kind of existence of its own that is detached from reality. But I think, when you go back to the historical, I see mathematics as coming out of experience, and that's why it's so fruitful. So,
and just to add to that, Terry McGruder says, we do the history of science. We have to include all of the ancient mythologies and everything to see how people began to organize their understanding of the stars and the nature of the movements of day and night. We dealt with what we now call mythologies, but at the time it was the best they had based on experience. I mean, your point is it's all a developmental thing. Science is not just one day we've got everything down, and we still have yet to discover many things. And so we can honor the whole path that is there and recognize the advances forward. And maybe some things that we still say that's the best explanation we have, even though we know we're probably going to discover more about it. So
Sure. Let me nuance then my geometry claims just to see if
Okay.
maybe we're more on the same page there.
yes,
I'm sure that Euclid absolutely saw this as being coming from his experience. Again, it was very, very close. And I think we can argue that this abstractive tendency was also a product of the time where people were trying to do it just in general. They were trying to do exactly this kind of natural theology of what do we see here, what must be true beyond that. I mean, the Pythagoreans, were doing the music of the stars and all the rest. And I think that there is a way of faithfully approaching Euclidean geometry like you can faithfully approach Newtonian physics, which is we're using it. It's the best we've got. We can, it continues to press us up against reality. It continues to press up against what it is. And now we're going to realize eventually that all these idealized structures that we've been operating with that have been close enough for us to do whatever we need to do, they don't really hold up in the end. And I think there's a way of doing that in a way that's responsible. But so, no, I mean, I think that's a more nuanced perspective. So you're right. I am taking a very modern perspective on the nature of geometry. But I do think that there were a lot of people who saw precisely that abstraction as being a way to generalize their experience to something that was independently true. So you're right. I didn't mean to impugn the ancient mathematicians. I have a lot of respect for them.
It was Tom's main point in theological science was that theological science and natural science are both valid intellectual disciplines and are justified. I use that term, justified, by their results. But the results of natural science are justified in terms of what is natural. Theological science is justified by God. The whole point of justification by grace alone is that it is true because God, in God's own being, is true. And as we explore and are invited inwards and upwards in our thought with God, our thought is put right. And we now understand faith and hope and love in new ways. And that is part of the ongoing justification of theological work. The problem of using geometry as a model of how theology ought to work, because it was a good eye-opener to discover with Einstein that Euclidean geometry was limited, and its failures, and it is, I think, a century and a half of failure prior to the 19th century, that they thought that, well, that's just, we're not smart enough, we haven't figured it out yet. And it was not until the physicists used geometry to justify their physics that the geometers discovered that physics was justifying their geometry. It was a mutually reinforcing truth-telling that was taking both of them deeper and further into a common quest. And that's essentially why Einstein eventually declared he was not interested in any geometry that was not linked to physics. And he was not interested in any physics that could not explain itself, at least in part, by showing the geometry of what it's doing, that it can be laid out in that way, because it is one intellectual quest. It is not several, but it does require, and I go back and strike on this because this is one of Tom's main points, that all of creation in all of its truths and sciences is contingent. It has its truth in creation. It does not possess any of the truth of God, and any of its falsehoods are not impinged into God. It is all contingent. And that is what we have been several times calling the radical dualism of Tom's thinking. It's the contingency. Notice eventually, when he discovers how useful that concept is, he drops several of these other ways of putting it. Because I got a drawer full of dualisms here. I got radical dualisms and contingent dualisms, and I got some other dualisms here, and some of them are just dualisms that my mother made up. That had to be cleaned up and made plain. And for Tom, when he discovered how Athanasius had insisted on the same contingent reality of creation and the fundamental priority of the Trinity in any understanding of creation, and so that Trinity, as it were, blesses, hallows, and makes rational creation, so that the human, blessed and rational, can live in it and discover it. It does not need to know everything about it, but the creature can be the creature. So that radical distinction between creator and creature is the foundation of good theological thinking and good natural thinking. So if you want to wiggle and worm in there and come up with a natural theology, I join with Travis. I say, why bother? Just call it theology if it's theology. Call it natural science if it's natural science. I do point out that this essay was published separately in 1970. And I recall from Tom's preface to Theological Science that he rewrote that book 3 times because he was trying to work out its epistemology, and it was driving him nuts. And every time he'd pull it all apart and stitch it back together, there'll be these odds and ends. He said, there's 2 more books I need to write. One of them ended up being contingency and is it contingency and reality?
Contingent order. Divine and contingent order.
Yeah, and the rationality of God. And I would love to go and check in the manuscript collections of the Torrance and see if the original manuscript of this essay doesn't have big chunks of manuscript that was going to be used in theological science, didn't get used. He's making the same discoveries about the same time. So if we want to clear up for ourselves what was he saying in this essay, the best place to go is Theological Science and look up natural theology, because there's about 20 entries. And it really does become important. But for our purposes here tonight, I want to stress again and again, there is the dualism between creator and creature, which is necessary, and it's Trinitarian. Keep it. But there is the dualism of René Descartes between the spirit or the spiritual things, thought things, and material things, physical things, that the earlier in our conversation, Jung-Il was saying, they found as mathematics, they kept trying to prove the rational foundations of mathematics all through the late 1890s, 1900s, 1990s. It was not holding together. They could not find the one epistemological linchpin around which everything could cohere, and because there was nothing to justify it in the sense we've been talking here. If the main point Paul Molnar wanted to make is that when Tom took this analogy of geometry to Barth and got Barth to agree to think about it a while, Paul in particular was saying, but if Barth had accepted Tom's argument at that time, that would have been bad. That would have not been a good thing. Barth happily moved on. He had other fish to fry, and Tom did too. By the time we get to the Christian doctrine of God, he's got this stuff all settled. It does not bog him down anymore. But I complimented Paul on his essay in the T&T Clark Handbook on the similarities and differences between Torrance and Barth, because he answered the question the editors asked. He said, here are their similarities and here are their differences. And hey, have a look at the slight difference between Torrance and Barth on natural theology is rather telltale. And what Barth is saying without using the words, Torrance is saying by using other words. And my advice, says Molnar, is to Torrance, is drop the word new. Just drop it. And you and Barth will be right back together again, like you should. So that is why I had my mute off.
Okay.
And I showed my hand at the beginning that I generally think that Torrance is certainly yearning. I think Torrance is much closer to Barth and should stay there.
I don't see a point of necessary division from them. Just moving on to that into the next section on the rejection of deism. That's simply overcoming the duality we've been talking, or the dualism we've been talking about. So Barth is committed to one coherent interaction with God, with our world and creation and incarnation. So the unitary. That's, if you're not dualistic, it's unitary. There's God and the world that have to be held in a duality, that we need to hold them together. The nature of proper science will allow each thing within that to have its proper catalological discussion, engagement. So on the top of the next page, 150, about 5 lines down, that is to say, we can operate properly only with reasons that arise on the actual ground we are investigating, within the limits of the noetic structure required by the nature of the given object. So there's a common world, and within that, each thing has to proceed on the ground of the basis. This is Katafusan in a broader definition of what is there. And so the last sentence there, Barth claims to detect in it an independent natural theology. So the nature of the curse will always be independent, right? It's something achieved and operating from an independent stance. With Anselm, was there anything that Anselm added to the conversation that you felt would be helpful to note?
I think that my notes are, and maybe this is me, maybe I run out of patience by the end, but whenever I'm running one of these things, I find myself just overflowing with thoughts and connections and expositions in the first half, and the second half, it's like, yep, and here is another outworking of the same point. At least I feel like he does that a lot. I feel like which is not necessarily bad. It just means I don't know that I have anything else to say about some of that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't know there's anything particularly that we need to jump into there. So I'm going to hop over to Augustine and Aquinas. There seems to be a sense in which Augustine, a main complaint is the Vistagia, the nature of the vestiges, the Trinity that Augustine still allows for, in which you have vestiges, then you've got people building on a basis of something that they see. You have 3 palm trees together and you say, oh, it's just like the Trinity. It's just, you're looking everywhere for 3s and, combinations of 3s. And I have people do this all the time. But to say, when you do that, you're reading 3s onto the world in a way that's not necessarily listening to God at all.
I want to invoke Elmer Collier again.
Piece too, which the Neoplatonic piece, you might be able to explain a little bit more of the dimension of Neoplatonic thinking for Augustine that makes Torrance and Barth resist him as a starting point?
I probably don't know that I can do that right now, but the reason when I think about the Vestigia Trinitatis, I always think about something that Elmer Collier taught us in class, and he said that when you whenever someone uses like a children's sermon and they talk about the Trinity is like water or the Trinity is like an egg, he said he was bearing with his own experience where it says, I feel he wonders if people say, I feel like the Trinity is supposed to be really important, but after hearing that, it doesn't seem like it has anything to do with my life at all. That is always what I felt whenever I read, Augustine's Vestigia Trinitatis. Like, well, maybe God's kind of like mind, emotion, and will. Maybe God's like I don't think that helps us at all. I am totally baffled. Again, probably historically it makes more sense. But it's hard for me who can appreciate the fact that Augustine was clearly another class of intellect over most of his peers at the time. And it just baffles me that he would get so bogged down in all of those things. I don't know that I'm not sure that I can coherently right now talk about the Neoplatonic participationism in a way that is coherent. I think I probably have like a grasp of one, but I think I will do a bad job.
And again, the nature of Gunton's critique of Augustine is that he was dualistic at some level, and particularly his confessions turned Christian thinking to an inward examination like his confessions did. And we dualistically, in a sense, we're separated from the world. And though it's a prayer about me, God, God help me, I'm a sinner, et cetera, like that. And so there, even with somebody like Augustine, the people critique, of course, Gunton, but I think there's something about, if it wasn't in Augustine's mind, it has been part of the tradition of the West to take the Augustinian and turn to the self, the incurvatus in se, and to take it from, who are we who know, receive, and love God and love one another in ways that are correspondent. So moving on to Thomas, then, the criticism seems to be that though he's better, he still bases everything on sense experience. So once
Right.
again, that's a sensibility. So you're beginning with the presuppositions, or as I'm calling them, prejudices about what you sense. And I think Polanyi
Right.
says every scientist chooses what they're going to study, and they don't study everything. And so if we just stop back and go, it's great that they choose to study anatomy, it's great they study the stars, but they don't have the whole. And there is a plea for the whole. Aquinas was kind of trying to do the whole, but he just began with senses. And so it seems as though maybe there's a default to that makes him somebody who's going to begin with analogia entis, the sense experience of being, that becomes problematic for Roman Catholic theology.
Well, I think there's also a connection here with what we were talking about before, where the problem with natural theology is once if you start there, you're going to end up being trapped there. And I think there's probably an element of Thomas Aquinas is so interested in Aristotelian philosophy that I think that because he got stuck in there, it seems to be one of the accusations that Torrance is making here. Because even the very last line of that section there, the fact that this natural theology, with its claim to universal validity, was treated as a preambula fide, opened the way for revealed theology to be interpreted on its basis and then domesticated within the thought forms of Philosophia Perennis, which it employed. That this idea of, if we assume that Aristotelian philosophy is neutral and doesn't actually impact anything that we use it to understand, then fine. But Torrance trying to say, no, you can't do that. It is going to impact it, just the same way that natural theology is going to impact it. And as I was saying, I think that the engaging perfect being theology is going to impact everything else you do. And I think that there's a way, there's probably a way of saying, like learning, I think there's still a value in some ways of studying philosophy, and logic and mathematics, because it teaches you to think differently. You realize the ways I'm used to thinking aren't the only ways to think. But to start by saying, Aristotle got the world figured out, I just need to apply his method correctly, is already to have a committed metaphysic, which is an a priori at that point.
Yeah. Which, like saying, if you want to find a spouse, come up with a list and go out and look for them. Your list is going to predetermine so many things and exclude all kinds of things, and include people maybe it shouldn't, because you're only noticing certain things that you want. And the list just gets in the way of actually engaging the nature of what a personal relationship looks like. when we move on to page 154, we move into the Protestant natural theology. And so the Cartesian dualism, the separation of subject and object, which again, you get people who ask the how questions and other kind of things flow from that, as J.B. Torrance talked about it. But basically, God and humanity are separated in the Cartesian separation. And so once again, we have this Achilles tendon of, if you think as Protestants, it's all about, God in the abstract and doctrine and, arguments, but we never do anything, that would be problematic. If it's all about me becoming a better person, morality, piety, all those things, the nature of what happens within different forms of Protestant formations as the protest at one level was about the Roman Catholic Church, but at another level, it's a protest of who's the authority here. I don't want that authority to be there. So we want to be the authority, or one step further, I want to interpret the Bible in a way that I am the authority, is, kind of an ultimate outworking of that. So it was just a fracturing of the nature of what theology was supposed to do, in a way that the Protestant world in its protest was not humble and submissive to God, but was really seeking for its own basis for doing its natural theology.
We'll have a little footnote here that
Yes.
Torrance describes Cartesian dualism as being a dualism between subject and object. I don't know anybody else in the world who does that. They tend to say mind and body is the Cartesian dualism. So just be aware of the fact that that is an idiosyncratic term that I don't think he's necessarily wrong. I think you can, in my book, I try to explain how those two ideas might be connected, but he never connects them as far as I know. Young Gil,
Do you think he means the subject is the mind and the object is the physical world?
Maybe.
That might be what he means. What did you kind of conclude that he might mean?
It's in the book, man. I don't know. I haven't read it for a little while.
Okay.
I was in Austin. Young Gil had a hand. I want to hear what he has to say.
I just have a comment on Torrance's characterization of Newton's notion of absolute space and time, independent of events and processes. To me, I don't see that. When I studied Newtonian mechanics, I didn't see that kind of dualism there. This must be a philosophical interpretation, because yes, space and time are absolute in the Newtonian sense, because it pervades all of reality. But that's the place in which events and processes happen with specific coordinates and so on. So I'm not sure what he means by the independent here. So
would it be something related? And I don't know the answer to the question necessarily, other than I'm assuming you are well familiar with space-time and incarnation. Because I'm wondering if maybe his distinction between the ways in which Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics all thought of space might play a role in that. But I don't. I have an inkling that there might be a connection between those two.
Yeah. Okay. Right. I mean, he talks about the kind of place. I mean, the container notion, as opposed to kind of a relational notion, which is definitely Einsteinian and field theory. I agree. It's just that if you study Newtonian mechanics per se, I just don't see, it's a coordinate system to say where it happens, but I don't see it as a philosophically a kind of an entity in itself that is separate from events. So anyways.
Well, I'm not defending necessarily, other than I'm wondering if to a certain degree it's like, but neither did Plato's understanding of space. He would have seen that as self-evident. Like it was. He would have not said it was a philosophical thing. He just would have treated it as normal. And so it makes so. I think it's one of those things where it makes me wonder if Newton absolutely is. How does this sound to you? And I am freewheeling here, but I have a thought. Newton might be going about his business saying this is obvious. It's obvious that there's the coordinate system. It's obvious that that's it. That's all there is to it. And we might have all simply agreed indefinitely had Einstein and others not come along and said, well, hang on a second, there's another way of looking at this. Is it the kind of thing where like it becomes a philosophical conviction once there are alternatives that you're choosing between, as opposed to simply this is what all I know? I don't know.
And just add on that for Newton and like two generations following him, his presuppositions could work because they were still working out the concrete implications of much of what he had to say, and not just in mechanics, but in optics and in when he's trying to figure out gravity and how things move in space. It took a long time to work that out, and his genius was such that for 2 generations, it was hands down, Newton is the genius of the world. God said, "Let there be Newton." But at some point, the presuppositions began to fracture and fail. They could not encounter everything. It was not just a matter of somebody sitting back at Oxford puffing a pipe and saying, I've got another idea. Reality demanded, pounded, forced, cracked, smashed the Newtonian universe where it failed, and it was beginning to fail. That is why so many physicists were searching, laboring. How do we salvage something of Newton's mathematics, optics, and physics from this danger? Because the alternative is that the universe is dissolving into chaos. But Maxwell and others, Niels Bohr and then Einstein, others were always saying, no, we can hold this together. You just have to change a few presuppositions, one of them being the container notion of the universe. You get rid of that, and then things move enough that we can make this work. I was very influenced by Thomas Kuhn, so I don't see scientific revolutions going on over bridge or whist, as the case may be, in a club of gentlemen. It takes place in laboratories and in periodicals and in knockdown dragouts at the councils, as they cannot get these things to work. And I think calculating the speed of light was one of the practical experiments that was most difficult to explain or even project under Newton's presuppositions. But I don't know, I wasn't there.
Right. I mean, one comment I wanted to make about geometry. Yes, Einstein was instrumental in making space and time sort of front and center to reality, whereas before it was sort of a background, right? But just to be fair, non-Euclidean geometry was developed by mathematicians prior to Einstein. Riemannian geometry was developed by mathematicians just by looking at like postulate of parallelism and saying, maybe this is not true. And I think that's kind of the evolution there. And I guess one lesson that I impute from that is when we're dealing with finite things, we can be very certain. But when we extrapolate that to the infinite, which is what the parallel postulate is an example of, then we need to be very humble that we cannot assert something. And then in a sense, it becomes a game at that point because you're asserting something that we have no experience directly with. So
this is not a topic, but at the top, whenever someone leaves, it tells me that they've left at the top of my screen, and it said the kingdom left, and I got very nervous.
The kingdom is still present, the one you need. So I want to make sure we get on your 5th page, the answer of justification. You asked the question: is this the practical heart of the question? So I mean, that's a big question to ask. I just wanted you to, clarify why this seems to be, important to make sure we don't miss the point.
Well, he says, so Torrance is saying there needs to be a connection between general ethics and Christian ethics. And in a sense, I understand what he means. Like I've used the example of saying words have to mean something, right? They don't just float around indefinitely. It's simply not true. As Wittgenstein has made clear that our words are embodied in communities, and they don't just mean any old thing. You can't just substitute any old sounds for any other sounds and have it be equivalent. So obviously, I use the word red. I said we might not always mean exactly the same thing by red, but one thing we don't mean is elephant. There are some stability in our meanings, and so I understand that there's a desire to say when we say that the ways of God are good, we want that to be recognizable to people who are not Christians to understand what we mean by good in that situation. And I'm wondering if that's the practical question here, because if we say that all the things we can come to know or suspect about God through creation, we're saying, strictly speaking, they're all wrong. And even the points where they seem to use the same kind of language and making similar claims, when they're coming from the side of creation, as opposed to what we see in Revelation, that even if they look the same, they're not the same. The one's still strictly speaking false. And I'm wondering if maybe this idea is to try to say, so what I say here, the problem, the practical one, if Christian ethics, because then we're saying, then does it also mean that there's no relation between Christian ethics, and the ethics, the good that we can learn through our own life, through, Aristotle has a non-theistic ethics, Immanuel Kant has a non-theistic ethics. And, if there's no relation between those two, if we say, oh, the ways of God are good, and they say, well, hang on a second, what you are describing we think is evil, do we even get a hearing? And so part of the thing, though, is that we know that the gospel accuses humanity of loving darkness rather than light. We know that there's a certain sense that's the case. And I wonder if there's another parallel, because I think about, the rise of, let's, for a moment, I know this is an overly simplistic thing to say, let us assume for the moment that we live in a truly Einsteinian universe, which is a bold claim to just simply say it as such. But to the degree that we live in an Einstein universe, what that means is every measurement, every statement of Newtonian physics is, from an Einsteinian perspective, false. It might be really close. You might be able to do all kinds of things using one versus the other for most of our daily lives and all the rest. But technically speaking, if it doesn't take mass acceleration, those kind of things into account, it's false. So to a certain degree, I wonder if maybe that's the closer parallel, where to say, yeah, we're saying that what the world counts good, the gospel does not agree. It may be that many things that we say are good and what the world says are good are overlapping, but by moving into the overtly theological world, we're still meaning something that's not quite the same as a non-theological world. Like to say, I love my children from a theological perspective may mean something more, deeper, richer than I would if I had no theological perspective. I'm sure someone would object to that. I'm sure that would be an offensive claim to make. But at that point, we're saying that theological ethics have no relation to general ethics in the same way that, Einsteinian measurements are all wrong compared to Einstein. In our practical lived life, they might have a lot of overlap, but they're technically not the same. And so I was just wondering if this is, I have that paragraph there. It says it's needed to ponder, where it says the ponder this in our world where much of secular ethics affirms some of the conclusions of Christian ethics, murder, adultery, theft, etc. How it seems to me to be the same issue, mutatis mutandis, as the geometry one. So I'm just wondering if that's, if we say that there is, I'm wondering maybe is part of the reason why Torrance wants to cling to this language of natural theology and not get rid of it. Is that to say then, because we could say that you might have a natural ethics and it gets transformed, it gets brought into the heart of theological ethics. But I would also argue it also becomes something different at the same time. And is this idea, it was hitting me in a different way as to maybe there's a reason from that point of view to say we're not getting rid of natural theology, we're just transforming it. But again, that feels like a distinction without a difference still to me.
Yeah.
But I was speculating wildly.
You are, and I love that about you. Barth said all theology is ethics, meaning that all that we say about God has implications for who we are in response to it. If we just take that one step into what Torrance is doing here, all science is ethics, and you can properly ground it in God or improperly do your science outside of God. In one case, all thing is oriented, given its meaning and purpose and investigation and use because of who God is. In the other, everything will default to the nature of human uses of it. So the morality of it, the ethics of it at some level is grounded in who God is, properly doing something where if we use the word natural theology, he means a theology of nature operating in the context of the life that God has created, sustains, and we participate in. And the only reason you would use natural theology there is to say that God actually still works in the natural world. I mean, I think there's a desire to keep God present and active. I don't know that you have to use that, but that is my sense. And I think you're kind of pointing in that direction as well, that God is not separate from the world, which many people hear Barth and natural theology. Well, then God doesn't care about the natural world. And I think Torrance is saying, oh, yes, he does. He created, he sustains it, and we do our scientific work within a world God created. And contingently, we do our scientific work and our church work and all these things. So the word contingent there is this orienting of once you understand God, everything else has a place, a context, and meaning that we can work out from there. So do you want to make any comment about the last section there on Henri Baudrillard? I wasn't sure where he ended with this. It seemed like kind of a, dropping a mic that's like,
It felt to me, and maybe I'm wrong on this one too. Like it felt to me like he was trying to stoke the flame, the positive flame of, can we learn from each other across the Protestant, Roman divide?
right.
Here's a person who is very much outside of Barth's perspective, who wants to generally agree. And let me see. I'm sure there's something else about this. I think that's probably why he ends that way, but I don't. Go ahead.
Did you want to say something,
Remember, in Church Dogmatics 2:1, where Barth spends several pages of the tiny type going into the First Vatican Council statement on natural theology. And he finds all sorts of people get it in his light wrong, and he finds one person who in his light got it right. But he says, for his sake, I'm willing to withdraw everything I said about the First Vatican Council if this is where the church is going. But in 1933, he couldn't find anybody going that way. And so he said, I'll stick by my guns until more happens. Apparently, he found that Torrance found Barth working with Henri Baudrillard in a way that says that he did find, and eventually Hans van Balthasar and dozens of other people. He found another way of doing Catholic theology without the sticky glue of the analogia entis. And that maybe why he wants to end here is that real natural theology done right is an ecumenical consensus that draws the churches together and brings out agreement rather than a bunch of I don't know, mechanical toys, little wind-up things, little playthings in the toy box of the theologians to be watches that go tick, 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 even though no one built them. How about that? Is that natural theology? No.
Right. Good. Well, I think we have gotten to the end of the chapter. There's always more that could be said, but I think that this has been a fruitful discussion with lots of really wrestling with terms. I think in the end to say there is not a significant difference between Barth and Torrance that one should identify, that you really need to separate them and see two different schools.
Right.
The nature of Barth is clearly to be committed to a theological distinction of words. Church dogmatics is the church's scientific self-examination of its distinctive talk about God. That was his agenda from page 1. And so when he's doing natural theology, is saying this will lead us astray. Torrance is clearly something that wants to integrate and contextualize the world of the natural sciences within theology. And so I think he's building bridges without departing from Barth. He's wanting to make sure that the bridges are intact for conversations to continue and to clarify. That's at some level what I hear that they're doing without disagreeing. So anyway, we will continue to have discussions on this. But Travis, thank you for your handout, for what you always bring as a fruitful questioning of your own. I love that people come and don't have all the answers. Gold star for you.
Thank you.
I think it helps us to become better investigators as well. And so if this reading group can be a place where we learn to be better investigators and just ask questions, that is a beautiful thing. A class that I took from Clark Pinnock once, the big thing I took out of that class was when we read Millard Erickson's book is, so what's missing from this book? And he taught me to recognize how many things are missing that we're not asking the questions, which there are 5 chapters on salvation, a page and a half on the resurrection, and nothing on Jesus as Messiah. No Old Testament anticipation for Jesus coming. He said, what difference does that make? And of course, it makes all kinds of difference. So in our reading of Torrance and Barth, to ask what's there is part of it, but what's missing, what needs clarification still, I think this just makes us better thinkers and a community that's prodding each other forward in the most helpful way. So you are wonderful at doing that. So you were the person for this, and thank you for that. Next week, we are looking at the chapter 6, The Legacy of Karl Barth, and Jeff McSwain will be our guest for that. He's written on Barth, Torrance, Bonhoeffer, conversations about the nature of grace, etc., as well as another series of books that he's coming out, and he'll talk about that a little bit as well. But he will be a wonderful person to pick up on the legacy of Karl Barth and what that he's done. So exciting times next week. So thank you everyone for being here, for continuing this exciting journey through the study of two great theologians, T.F. Torrance and Karl Barth, and for all the other voices that chip in, Ken, Young Il, Bill, all the things that you bring to the table are wonderfully helpful as well. So thank you all. Blessings on you, and we'll get all this posted up as soon as possible. Share it with your friends and your enemies so that everybody's moving forward in a path of learning the adventure. So blessings on you.